Hi, everybody in Humanities 105. Nice to be checking in with all of you once again, and I hope the end of April here is finding you in decent shape. Hope everybody is healthy and doing well. So why don't we start off with class-related business? Just a reminder of upcoming due dates, that sort of thing. So your final essay proposal, which remember is the topic, the thesis, the outline, and the bibliography. That is still that. Well, when I'm recording this, that's due a couple of days from now. By the time you're watching this, that should be something you've already turned in. I will be grading and giving written feedback to everybody as quickly as I can on the proposals that you've submitted, and then the full essay will be turned in. It's due at the latest by the end of finals week. If you want to get it done sooner than that, that is of course perfectly fine. Other than that, you've got one last round of reading tests and discussion boards for this week. And I did want to mention part of the discussion board this week is something that I do genuinely want people to. You might not have the. Well, actually, you might get some discussion going. But one of the prompts is going to be creating questions that you would like to see on the final exam. That's always something I really like to do in class, and obviously we haven't been in class for about a month and a half at this point. So we will have to adapt as best we can. We'll do it through the discussion boards, but I always like to make the exams as student created as possible. I've found that that is an excellent way of getting people to a kind of look back, reassess what we've learned, what we've talked about, but it also gives you a fair amount of freedom over what content gets covered and about how the questions themselves are formulated. You can do multiple choice, true or false, definitions, matching, whatever question format you want to go for these exam questions. I would love to see it. I'll do some edits, put that together into the final exam, which you will take on Brightspace anytime during finals week. Beyond that, I don't think I have much else as far as class related stuff goes. Oh, I guess the last thing I should mention there is that the final day on which I will be accepting work is Sunday, May 10th, which is the weather. I think the weather and the lockdown have been fooling us a little bit. It doesn't feel like May 10th is happening soon. It is. May 10th is it's coming at you real fast here. So make sure that you've been keeping up on everything. Make sure that you turn work in. If you've missed it, if you've fallen behind, remember you can always turn work in, even if it's past the due date. Just want to get it closer to as close as possible to the due date to maximize your points. But May 10th, like I said, is the last date that I will be accepting work. Beyond that, got one final topic to discuss this week, and it is one of my favorites. Maybe my favorite form of mass. I don't know if I could name a favorite form of mass media, but we're going to be talking about books. Going back to the start, in fact, if you'll recall, technologically, the printing press and the printed book are the oldest form of mass media. They are a form of communication that could reach an enormous number of people in a very short amount of time. And this is a technology that spread relatively widely, especially initially in European cities, but globally in an amount of time that historically was unprecedented. Now, that being said, the printing press was invented nearly 600 years ago at this point. So there's, maybe some more recent inventions that are bringing us the printed word slightly faster than a Gutenberg press could, but it is still yeah, and book. But that being said, book publishing, which is really what we're talking about here, not all printed material, but book publishing is still a vital form of mass media, if you ask me, and one that has, I think, some surprises to it. So, just to give you some basics on the technological side of thing, um, printing presses are no longer hand cranked. I honestly couldn't tell you how modern printing presses work. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which is an adage I've always liked to repeat. I do know Chicago at one point was a major home of the printing industry. Printers Row at the southern end of the loop is where modern printing was born, really, the linotype was invented down there. But these days, most of the printing is done all over the place. I don't think there is any real like focal point for the printing industry. Regardless, technologically, there are four major formats of book publication in American mass media. There is the initial form of release. Happily, I've got books just hanging around right here that I can use as an example. Hardcover. These are printed with hard covers, usually made out of cardboard. And these are the initial form of publication. This one is a book about gentrification. Haven't actually read it yet, but someday. It's nice and skinny. These are the initial form of publication, and they are typically the one of the more expensive formats of publishing a book, usually about $10 more, sometimes even higher, compared to paperbacks. Oh, which I have one right here. This one not skinny at all. It is 1,100 pages long before you get to the works cited at the end. I've been working on this one for like a year, and I think I'm going to finish it before June, maybe. I'll be I'm going to get myself a drink of beer when I finish that book. But paperbacks are usually cheaper. For a long time, paperbacks were very much associated with pulp fiction, as they were known, romances, adventure stories, those sorts of things. These days, hardcover versus paperback is usually just a timing sort of thing. Like I said, paperbacks are more expensive and they're more prestigious to some degree. And then we also have ebooks, the most popular format of which is the Kindle, which is a market that Amazon monopolizes, of course. And then there is also audiobooks. Now, I do want to point out that audiobooks are very much an overlap with the music industry, but generally it's considered part of printing. Essentially, it's a collaboration between printing companies and music companies to create audiobooks. And to be fair, many times the publishers and the music companies might be corporate relations, so to speak. But there's a fair amount of overlap there. So those are the four major formats of book publication. Initial release is always hardcover, ebook, audiobook. Paperback usually is not released until about a year after the initial release. They want to grab that higher price point for the initial buyers. Beyond that, not really all that much to say about printing technology. It's not worth getting into the nitty gritty of how modern printing machines work, that sort of thing. All right, so jumping over to the business side of things, this is actually a field, an aspect of the book industry that I think has one of our surprises here. The publishing industry, if I'm recalling the stats from the textbook, brings in an annual revenue of around $28 billion. At least that's the most recent number that the textbook has for us. And that is double the annual revenue of the music industry. It's roughly double how much money movie studios make from ticket sales, from box office receipts. It is larger than video game revenue, even. I think video games are closer, but larger. And that is always something that I think shocks people a little bit. The fact that the book publishing industry has a revenue twice as large as the movie industry, as the music industry. Does it feel like books are as popular as all movie releases and all music releases combined? They're not. Books are not that popular. It'd be a different society if they were. Instead, what we really have here is the fact that the book publishing industry contains some fields that might surprise us a little bit, or at least aren't what we commonly think of. So half of the revenue, roughly half of the revenue for the book publishing industry comes from trade books. Trade books are the kind of thing you find if you walk into a bookstore, and I cannot tell you how much I miss bookstores. The next time I walk into a bookstore and browse for 45 minutes not looking for anything will be the best 45 minutes of that day. Ugh, I miss bookstores. But the kind of things you find in there, fiction, nonfiction, cookbooks, photography books, kids books, those are all trade books. The two that I just showed you there are trade books. The other major markets for the publishing industry are things that you can find in bookstores, but it depends on the kind of bookstore. And some of that, and even then, not necessarily in bookstores. The next of the markets is called the professional book market. These are books created specifically for professions that need a constantly updated round of printed books. Think of hospitals and doctors' offices. They need the up-to-date medical literature, and that's an annual, maybe semi-annual publication process. Law offices have much the same sort of thing. Think of any profession that has to rely on updates to the material on an annual basis. That is the professional book market. And then the last of the major markets are both related to education. There's one called L-High, E-L-H-I, that's elementary to high school students. And then you have the higher education marketplace, which is college and graduate school textbooks. Now, I do need to point out, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I do need to point out that typically the higher education marketplace, college textbooks, creates more revenue than the L high marketplace, elementary and high school. And I want you to think about that for a quick second while I sip my coffee and ask yourself why. Why would higher education textbooks create more revenue than higher ed or than L high? I'm sure you have some thoughts. There's a lot of reasons, even though logically it wouldn't seem to make sense. There are many millions more elementary and high school students than there are college students in the United States. But there are structural factors that make higher education a enormously lucrative field for textbook publishers. Part of that is that there are much more courses in higher education, much more specificity, especially once you get to the grad school level. Part of it as well comes from the fact that college students have to individually buy their textbooks. Many times in elementary to high school, elementary to high schools, at least some of the books are bulk purchased by the school district or by if it's a private school, by the school administration, and then distributed to the students without an upfront fee. It's just rolled into tuition, that sort of thing. Tuition or taxpayer tax funding, these sorts of things. So bulk purchasing is something that drives down prices. If you're a school district like the Chicago Public Schools, you have hundreds of thousands of students buying millions of textbooks. That is an enormous amount of purchasing power. So you can approach Pearson and be like, hey, give us a better deal on this because we are giving you so much business. And usually they're able to negotiate down. Whereas all of you taking Humanities 105, do you have the purchasing power to go to Pearson and be like, hey, get me a better deal? You do not. No, you do not. So the fact that purchases are, and this is a decision that was made. This is an administrative decision by publishers and colleges, but purchases are done by individual students rather than by the colleges themselves. Drives up prices, drives up revenue. The other thing is that many college students buy their textbooks with loan money. That is money loaned to them much more often than not by the federal government. And the federal government has already typically dispersed those loans by the time textbook payments are being made, which essentially means that the federal government, instead of just subsidizing higher education so that colleges can bulk buy textbooks, loans you money at interest so that you can individually buy them from publishers. This guarantees higher revenue for the book publishers. It guarantees higher rates for the banks that are issuing those loans, and it guarantees it also guarantees some financial return for the federal government, though paidly not. But essentially, it's a system that's set up to screw you, and that is why I always encourage my students to find used copies, other copies. It is pretty scammy. It's pretty scammy. It makes me wonder why I haven't gotten into that field because there's a lot of money to be made if you're unscrupulous enough. All right. The last of the major topics I wanted to talk about, of course, is the cultural side of the role of books in our society. And this is always one that I do love talking about in the classroom because I think books have a unique role in American media and culture because I think they are different than movies and television, which are forms of entertainment for the most part. I think they're different than something like the internet, which is mainly informational, different than social media, which is mainly communicative. I think books have a special status in American society. They are seen as, or their function, I should say, is seen as enlightenment. Just the act of reading a book itself is good for you. That is something that I'm sure has been told to you many, many times. I know in my experience, I was told very often when I was a kid, stop playing video games, stop watching TV, go read a book. Well, to be fair to my mom and dad, I do read a lot of books. I think I read 80 of them last year, which is I was very proud of that number. I play video games more than 80 hours of video games, certainly, but don't tell mom and dad. But I would genuinely agree with that. I think books are a form of communication that encourages deep thinking, contemplation. They add an enormous amount of knowledge if you engage with them, and I think they deserve that status. And I think you can see that status reflected in a couple of interesting ways. First of all, education is still largely based around books. You do readings for class at basically every level of education. That is very much reflective of the fact that books and literacy are the foundational point of acquiring knowledge, even in a class that involves a lot of discussion. I think you can also see that in the fact that we have public libraries where you can borrow books for free and then return them. And in Chicago, you don't even get charged if you return them late. They eliminated late fees, which is a great policy. That is rare. Certainly, you can borrow DVDs or CDs from the Chicago Public Library, but that is not generally seen as a major form of getting that content. Books are really what you get at the library. And I think it shows something that even publishers themselves are fine with this. They sell their books to the library, for one. So they still get some revenue there, but they understand that libraries are part of the common public good. Not to say that people aren't opposed to libraries sometimes, but they are one of the generally rare elements of American society that everybody sees as good for us. Now, that being said, the flip side of books being seen as a tool for enlightenment is that they can perhaps as strongly, or even sometimes even more strongly than other forms of mass media, excite opposition. Book banning is the way this generally comes up. Book burning, happily, is not too common a thing in American society. If we ever get to the point where we're burning books, get out of town. Get out of town. But book banning, especially trying to get books pulled from library shelves, is more common. There's hundreds, thousands of challenges to public libraries or school libraries holding certain titles and making them available in any given year. And a lot of the opposition, you can kind of guess where it's coming from. The most common reason that books get challenged or banned is sex and sexuality, both explicit or even even suggestive inclusions of sex will get books banned. You can also see it in any discussion of non-heteronormative sexuality or gender identity being pretty frequent targets for the urge to ban books. I do always find it very funny. Usually the ranking of like reasons to oppose books goes like sex, language, sexuality, violence. And I always just love that. Like, which of those is worst for you? Well, I mean, practice safe sex. Maybe don't curse where not appropriate. But, of all of those things, the most likely to kill you is violence. And we think that's less threatening than sex and swearing. America. Uh, And by virtue of that, you can also see pretty frequently that books get banned with some frequency. Sometimes that's specific titles. There was a controversy a few years ago in the Chicago public school system banned the graphic novel Persepolis. You may remember that. And oftentimes it's the kind of books you expect. 50 Shades of Grey, yeah, that's going to be controversial. But I do always love pointing out when classic books are banned. Something like The Great Gatsby gets challenged somewhat frequently. My assessment is it gets challenged because the theme of the novel is that the American dream is kind of empty. Jay Gatsby lives the dream and still winds up dead in the bottom of his swimming pool, an empty soul. Oh God, the end of that book. So good. You see the other classics that get challenged frequently, like Beloved or The Color Purple, or To Kill a Mockingbird, all of which definitely get challenged because they're anti-racist. I bet a lot of racists find other reasons to challenge them, but it's because they're anti-racist, and that's what gets them banned. My favorite of the classic banned books, though, is Charlotte's Web. This is always one when I say that in class. I so wish I could see the look of shock, the gasps when I say Charlotte's Web gets banned. A seminal novel for children, and I guarantee you it gets banned because Charlotte dies. That makes kids cry their eyes out. And if you're that kind of parent, your response is, yes, it is sad. Let's talk about it and learn from this. Or that's the good response. The bad response is, how dare that effing teacher make my little Jimmy cry? That's not manly, or some bullshit like that. The fact that we are willing to throw books out of libraries says a lot about their power, about the influence that the written word still has in our society, even as we transition towards a much faster audio visual mass media diet. And I think that is why it's worth spending 21 minutes talking about the topic. All right. That will wrap up our video lectures for the semester. I'll be on Zoom the next couple of weeks, but I have enjoyed speaking to all of you. Wish we could have finished the semester in the proper fashion, but we did our best in the circumstances, I think. And best of luck to all of you with whatever you do in the future. And I hope everybody stays healthy and safe and sane as the coronavirus lockdown continues. Bye bye.